Hi, Rob. Welcome to Aspen Ignites. It's so nice to have you today.
Thanks. Nice
Yeah.
to meet you, Sarah.
Can you tell us a little bit about who you are?
So I'm the executive director and curator of the Letterform Archive in San Francisco. We are a special collection library and museum with about 100,000 objects in the history of graphic design. The Bauhaus collection is one part of that. In fact, it is within a larger 20th century avant-garde collection. But the collection itself goes back to cuneiform tablets, medieval manuscripts, early printed books. It's the entire history of written communication.
Well, we know that the Resnick Center for Herbert Bayer Studies is here in Aspen, and you have recently curated a typography exhibition here. Can you tell us a little bit about how Bayer's work kind of ties in and connects with the Bauhaus movement and the exhibition that you've put on?
Okay. There's like four
Oh,
questions
sorry.
there. So I'll start with Bayer. So Bayer was born in Germany, and then he was first a student at the Bauhaus, and then later the typographic master. After that, he worked in advertising in Berlin for a little while, and landed in the U.S. And so the last half of his story is in the U.S. And a lot of it was in Aspen. So that's the connection with the Aspen Institute. And in fact, Bayer designed many things around the campus. I keep walking around and people bump into me because I'm taking pictures of like posters on the wall and stuff. They have a quite remarkable collection of his work, including graphic design, as for the Container Corporation. And so some of the same stuff that's in the show. But Bayer spans probably the longest time frame within the exhibit itself, because we have work of his before he was at the Bauhaus, when he was a student, when he was a master, and then commercial work in Germany, and then work in the U.S. And so he kind of represents that whole flow, including the flow of European expatriates bringing the new typography to America. So I think I answered maybe two.
No, I think that's good. We can keep going. I was just getting like warmed up. So how does the Bauhaus philosophy kind of tie in with the typography and what did come from Europe with them?
Okay, well, the Bauhaus generally was very influential because it proposed a new pedagogy in arts education, basically. And it's been influential on that basis for the pedagogy and some of the core ideas that came out of it ever since, including the sort of multidisciplinary approach where all of the students and all of the masters did some of everybody's craft, and there was a kind of a foundational level where everybody learned everything. And it led to some very interesting stuff. A lot of the stuff that's in the exhibit is essentially graphic design. It's advertising postcards or posters or whatever, but done by people like Paul Klee, Kandinsky, who are not graphic designers. Whereas Moholy-Nagy and Bayer were graphic designers. There were many other artists at the Bauhaus, all of whom produced some graphic design because they did a little of everything. And so that's part of the fascination of it. The school is probably best known for Klee and Kandinsky, but also Gropius and Mies, who were the kind of architecture. They were both directors, and they both came to the U.S. and were influential in architecture.
Bayer did not study typography, though, right?
He did.
He did?
Oh,
he
yeah,
did.
he did. And but he was a polymath. He studied everything.
Right.
He did painting. He did printmaking. He did advertising and typography and book design, illustration. Quite a lot of illustration and advertising, art direction, and illustration. So he did a lot of different things, and it was all informed by all of it, just as the Bauhaus operated generally.
Now, how has the Bauhaus, typography, how do we see it up in, now in contemporary times in contemporary graphic design?
So the Bauhaus kind of established an early mid-century style of typography that was asymmetrical, used a lot of lowercase letters, sometimes only lowercase letters, had white space and a dynamic arrangement, and lots of photography and photomontage with very clean and simple typography. And the Bauhaus was not the only place where that was happening, but it did pretty much originate in Europe. And the U.S., it came to the U.S. through many expatriates from Europe, especially Germany. And both Bayer and Moholy-Nagy came to the U.S. But there were many others that came from Europe. And they brought with them that sort of typographic simplicity and modernism, and it evolved into what we think of as mid-century modern graphic design, which is a lot of what Bayer did later in life, like the Geographic Atlas, is, it's a mid-century masterpiece. It's not really a Bauhaus thing, but there's a through line, there's a thread of influence between them.
And, when you talk about that evolution, the early typography from the Bauhaus, they sort of did not want to deal with serif, right? And, kind of went into a not, only working with non-serif typefaces. Can you talk a little bit about what that means? Because I think for a lot of people, they're not, it's not
Well, I
clear.
think there was the early modernists had a kind of a purist approach to form, and one of the Bauhaus famously had the kind of elemental shape and color constructs, which were sort of foundational and get to the simplest elements of all of these things. Really, they apply in art and design, in metalwork. They had many craft workshops as well.
Talk about the significance of the use of sans-serif typefaces and Bayer's innovation and embrace of universal type.
So Bayer developed this concept of universal type, which is letter forms without uppercase or lowercase, and it's a kind of a unicase or simplified single case. And he made several very specific drawings of ideas for this. There are 3 of them in existence. 2 of them are at Harvard with the Gropius collection. One of them is in this show. And it's an original ink on board drawing of his universal alphabet, which is one set of 26 characters, but also the simplified forms, which are sans-serif and very clean. And in fact, in some of them, you can see the compass points that where he was using a compass to help draw the form. And they were an attempt, like a lot of the things at the Bauhaus, to find the elemental form. And so that carried out in the typography. They could simply stop using serif faces and stop using capitals, which they did to some degree in the journal. The books, interestingly, did not follow that. They probably wouldn't have been successful.
Yeah, it's hard when you're dealing with literary editors.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit more about the exhibition. Besides that piece that you just described, what are some of the other significant pieces?
So one of the things that's really interesting about graphic design at the Bauhaus is that from the founding of the school in 1919 until 1923, there was no typographic master. There was nobody teaching typography or graphic design, and there was no typography workshop. There was no type and no printing. They did, however, have printmaking, and so they could do linocut and woodcut and etching and silkscreen and all of the printmaking techniques, and they were taught, and that was what was available. So the first room of the exhibit is called Early Visions, and it's material done during that period before there was essentially type or a typographic teacher at the Bauhaus. And it's interesting. It's kind of wild. It's very different from what we think of as Bauhaus typography. It's not asymmetrical, lowercase, clean, lots of white space. It's in fact dense and expressionistic, and all of the letter forms are handmade because they had to be. And it's a really interesting and kind of lesser known part of the graphic design story of the Bauhaus. And it's a particular strength of the exhibit, so it's worth noting. It also has echoes in more recent times in graphic design, whereas there's a kind of a regular through line from the later clean Bauhaus typography to mid-century modern. The expressionist stuff kind of skipped a generation and came back in punk and early digital. So there's that. There's a room of all the publications, so they had a journal that they published for a number of years that was art directed by the different typographic masters at different times, and 14 books, which was the extent of the series, all common format, so series publishing, a kind of an early example of a really well thought out series. And Bauhaus masters, Klee, Gropius, Moholy-Nagy, all wrote for the series, but they also had contributors like Malevich from Russia and Van Doesburg and Mondrian. And so it was a book series kind of the Bauhaus perspective, but with a slightly broader range of topics and contributors. And also a very consistent design style, mostly created by Moholy-Nagy. And then the typographic masters, there's a section of the show that's basically the Moholy-Nagy, Bayer, and Schmidt room. Those were the three masters that taught in the typography and advertising workshop. And two of them landed in the U.S. Bayer, we've spoken a lot about. Moholy landed in Chicago and founded what was first called the New Bauhaus and then the School of Design. Went on to become the design school at IIT, which was the first PhD in design and is still going. So that's kind of a Bauhaus thread that came through Chicago. And Schmidt, who was ended his career as a graphic designer in Germany and is therefore probably less known, but he was also very talented. And then the other sections of the show involve contemporary and more recent typography and graphic design that epitomizes or echoes some of the Bauhaus aesthetics. And that's pretty much it.
Why do you think that the Bauhaus aesthetic has endured for so long and influenced so many artists and designers?
I think these things go in cycles. I think Bauhaus and a kind of a clean, asymmetrical, modernist typographic style, which dominated the 20th century for 50 or 60 years, was more continuous than most cycles in graphic design. And it comes around, and it's right now not so popular. I think it's more influential. The Bauhaus influence now has been more important in pedagogy and in the breaking down the silos within the academy.
So the Bauhaus really liked form and function, as well as like mass production. They wanted these things to be beautiful, but they also wanted them to be useful. Can you talk a little bit about that and why that was?
I think it was part of the holistic view of the pedagogy. There's a famous diagram which you can Google and find. It's a circle that kind of has the core principles of art and design in the middle, and then radiates outward through a variety of crafts and disciplines, and the ways that they can interact. And so that was part of the essential concept that Gropius had founding the Bauhaus, is that kind of holistic view of it. And and that's the thing that I think has been most enduring in its influence.
Well, thank you so much for your time.
Of course.
Yeah.
Thank you.